Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Here I'll explain in detail about Bloc, repository provider, Bloc provider, and how they're connected and how to use them. All right. So first we'll start with repository provider. All right. So if this is your app over here, so of course you have to use Bloc, and as you use Bloc, and if you want to do network requesting, you have to use repository provider. So what I mean by network requesting, it means that loading data from server. It could be cloud server, Firebase server, your own custom data server. So any kind of server or even database or even local database like that, okay? So we want to get data from there, and for that purpose, with combining with Bloc, we have to use repository provider. But of course, if you install Bloc package, it would be shipped out of the box, okay? All right, so first we have to have a repository provider, and once you have that one, what it will do, it will load data from the server. But it's not that simple as you think. Now, repository provider would need a block provider, so we have to assign a block provider to it, but meaning that actually block provider has to be as a child of repository provider. So we will create a block provider inside this repository provider. Now, actually, block provider needs to access the data that would be loaded from data server, or connecting with the data, or talking with the data server. So for that purpose, actually, once we create a repository provider, at the same time, we'll have a block provider as a child, and at the same time, block provider would take the instance of repository provider. And yes, I know it's a little confusing. Okay, let me show you the code, and with this, it'll make more sense to you. So now let's take a look at repository provider over here. And if you see that, you'll see that it's coming from Flutter Bloc package. And of course, inside this, actually, we are assigning an auth repository, which is actually a repository class. Now, if we go ahead and click on this, we'll see that actually it's a class. Now come back to this one. So if you use repository provider, you have to have a repository class to create a repository, or I would say to create resources that would talk to the database server. Now this is exactly what we have seen over here. So if you have a repository provider, you have to have a repository provider class or repository class. In the class, you might have methods and fields, and those methods and fields would be called from actually Bloc itself, which we'll see later using event classes or events. So far, our idea should be clear about at least few things. Okay, so repository provider is used for loading data from the server. And okay, it's just a provider. It needs something. What it needs a class. You can call that class actually anything, or you can also call it repository class. So inside this, we have to use this class to create a repository or a system. You can understand it like this. So that's what we have seen over here. So this is a repository provider, and inside this we have auth repository, which is used for authentication. You can call it anything. So as you see, the way that we are creating a repository or resources for our repository provider. Otherwise, it would be just empty. You have to have a class. You have to feed something. You have to give something. All right. Okay. Now, right after this, we'll see that. Okay. So repository provider also needs a block provider, and block provider would also need a repository provider instance. Now let's go ahead and check over here. So yes. So inside this repository provider, you see we have a child property, and over here we have a block provider, right? So block provider itself is sitting inside this repository provider, and that's amazing. Okay, now we also said that over here that block provider also needs the instance. Okay, now here this is another complexities at the beginning. So block provider actually need blocks. To create blocks, you have to have state classes and event classes, or states or events. Without these two, you can't have any blocks. Now, when I say block, actually it's a class. It's a class combination of state and event, but the convention is calling it block. Okay, just like we call it repository over here. So block provider needs blocks. Blocks would contain our state and event. So we have to have those things first. So those two things, states and class together, we create a class. That class, you can call it anything. In my case, I call it auth block, as you can see. So I'm creating a block. So this is the actual block that would use the repository provider instance. Okay, so as you see over here, I'm passing an instance of repository provider. And how to get the instance of repository provider? You have to use repository provider.auth and then auth repository, the actual class that you use to create a repository inside the provider. Okay, so now if you go ahead and see this class, so as you see, at auth block class, actually a block. Why? Because it extends block, and as it extends block, it takes two things, auth event or state. So that means event and state. And inside this, you see that we have an instance of auth repository provider, which is this one. So we have to pass this instance. So what do we do over here? We just simply go ahead and use repository provider.auth to get this instance, and then we pass it to this auth block using this auth repository property over here. And that's as simple as that one. So we already have event and classes. We combine them together to create a block, and that block also takes a repository provider instance, and that's all we did over here. Okay, so now this picture, the one that we have over here, should make sense. So first we have this empty repository provider, which is empty, and inside this we feed a class, and that class would be actually holding methods to talk with the outside world, and we'll get data back from outside world. But at the same time, repository provider needs BlocProvider for state management. So for that one, BlocProvider is also an empty provider, I would say. So you need blocks. So we create state and events, and combining them together, we create a block, which is a block class actually. And if we can create one inside this, actually we also feed the repository provider. Okay, now with this, all the pieces are put together and it works. So now this events and states are simply just classes. So over here we have seen that we have this auth block class, right? So let's come over here. So it takes event and classes. So if you go over there, you will see that we have some classes over here, and that's it. So as you can see, class like sign in request, sign up request, like that. So let's go back there and see one more time this auth state classes. All right, so over here, once again, states are also represented using classes in block, just like events are represented using classes. And that's what we see over here. So those classes would be all combined together inside a block class, and that's what we did over here. So this is our block class. So using this class, we create a block. If we create a block, we feed it to BlocProvider, and that's what we see over here. So this is our BlocProvider. So we create a block, we feed it. As we feed it, we also feed the repository provider. That's as simple as that one. Now, once again, over here, we have some other things that we need to see. So blocks, we said, we already know that blocks, they are a combination of state and events. Actually, so events and state, they all reside inside this block. But events could be also accessed from our UI. So if this is our UI can access this events. And if it's access this events, actually it triggers an event. So events are also accessed as methods from UI. So from UI, event would be triggered. So that means that if you have a form over here, the form will have data. So we can pass the data to this event. So that means we are passing the data to these blocks. That also means that we are passing the data to the block provider. That also means that we are passing the data to this repository provider. And we know that repository provider will have methods. So those methods would get called and will talk with the server. We pass the data to the server down. So that's how the whole thing works. So once again, so if you have a UI will have data. So your UI can access these blocks. How does it access the block? So let's take a look. So here in my UI, actually you can see that I have this BlocProvider.auth, and then we mentioned the block that we created. So this is the block that we created early. Now we are passing data. So as we pass data, actually we triggered an event. This is the sign up event that we created, and we pass the controller, like email controller.text, so text data, which is actually string. We pass them. All right. So after that, yeah, our event takes that, it puts into the block, block puts into the block provider feeds the data to the repository provider, and done. And that's how all things work with blocks. So if you have any question, leave a comment below and I will try to answer. Thank you.